Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Midtown Scholar Bookstore. Thank you for coming out on this dreary Thursday. We're happy you're here. We hope you feel safe, and we hope you enjoy tonight's program. Before we begin, I just have a few housekeeping notes. One, while our authors will take their masks off this evening for the conversation, we please ask that you continue to keep your masks on throughout the program, including the audience Q&A and book signing. Two, this event is being live streamed on Zoom and Facebook Live. So for those tuning in, please feel free to ask questions at any point via the Q&A box, and we'll try to get to as many questions as we can after the conversation. Three, we are now starting to announce many more events in April, May, June, and beyond. Please stay tuned to our website, social media pages, and e-newsletter to stay tuned to the latest events. We're really excited that their in-person events are back, so we'd love to see you here or virtually in the coming months. And lastly, perhaps most importantly, please consider supporting the bookstore and our author this evening by purchasing a copy of the book through the Midtown Scholar Bookstore. Every purchase helps support the author, the bookstore, and our ability to run these events as free and open to the public. We will have a book signing afterwards, so whether you're tuning in virtually or here in person, we hope you come away with a book. But now it's my honor to introduce our authors this evening. Our interviewer this evening is Ian Isherwood. Ian is Associate Professor of War and Memory Studies at Gettysburg College. He is the author of the book Remembering the Great War, as well as numerous academic reviews and articles. He gained his PhD at the Scottish Centre for War Studies at the University of Glasgow. Our featured author this evening is, of course, Michael Neiberg. Michael is the award-winning author of Potsdam, The End of World War II and the Remaking of Europe, Fighting the Great War, and Dance of the Furies, Europe in the Outbreak of World War I, among other books. He is Professor of History and the inaugural Chair of War Studies at the U.S. Army War College. Of course, the book we are here for this evening is titled When France Fell, the Vichy Crisis and the Fate of the Anglo-American Alliance. According to U.S. Secretary of War Henry Stimson, the most shocking single event of World War II was not the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, but rather the fall of France in spring 1940. Michael's book has been praised by the Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, historian Andrew Roberts, and many, many more media outlets. Michael and Ian into the bookstore this evening. So without further ado, please join me in giving them a warm Harrisburg welcome.
Well, good evening, all. It's nice to be here. So thank you all for coming out. Thank you to all of you who are Zooming in as well. It's a real pleasure to be here with my friend and my colleague, especially in the World War I world, Professor Mike Neiberg. I was thinking about Mike's recent book in preparation for this and thinking about how it fits with a lot of Mike's historical work in the past. And in particular, one of the things that sort of struck me is that Mike has a really impressive ability to take a subject that we think we know the story of, right? And what I mean by that is that there's kind of a common story about the past or a common consensus about it. And he has a unique ability to kind of take that and then to question it and make us to think maybe a little bit differently about that particular subject. And I was thinking, Mike, about another one of your books that I think actually goes well with this one too. And if there are any copies of the book here, I'd encourage you to buy them in addition to The Fall of France. But the book that Mike came out with a few years ago called The Path to War is an interesting book because in many ways, we think we know the story of the First World War, right? And about American interest and intervention in the First World War. And what Mike did in this book was he tells a story and has a very convincing argument that Americans were paying very close attention to what was going on in the war in Europe in 1914, 15, and 16 before America gets involved in the war in 1917. Now, the reason I say that this is a really novel approach is because the common story that's oftentimes told is that America's isolationist, that America's not paying attention, right? And although America was an isolationist to some degree, Americans were paying a lot of attention to what was going on in Europe from 1914 until 1917. Now, the reason I'm bringing this up is because I was thinking about this book as I was reading When France Fell, because there's something similar that's going on there, right, within this book. And I want Mike to talk more about this in a few minutes. But what's going on there is basically reminding us that although nations think of themselves in terms of being in isolation or think of conflicts very distant as being exactly that they're distant, that they're beyond reach, that the events that happen abroad determine in many ways a lot of events that happen at home. And so one of the things I was thinking about as I was reading When France Fell are the parallels that are going on between how Americans are viewing the war in Europe with great trepidation and with great concern from 1914 until 1917 is similar to how Americans are paying attention to the war in Europe from 1939 and especially in 1940. So one of the unique things I think about this book is that it kind of piggybacks with the rest of your work really well, Mike. And it's able to kind of create kind of this continued extensive about the way in which people pay attention to international events. So I wanted to start things, Mike, by just asking, where did you come up with, was there a particular source? Was there something that you uncovered that made you start thinking about 1940?
Yeah, this was the days before COVID, so I don't actually remember the exact moment when I decided I was going to write this book. But the aha that said I have to write this book, I'd had dinner with some French friends of ours, and I said, I'm thinking about this book on Vichy, and I'm thinking about the U.S., and there's just not much written on it. In fact, I can't find anything written on it from a serious scholarly standpoint. And this friend of mine said, well, you should go out to this place called La Courneuve, which is this archive halfway between Charles de Gaulle Airport and the city center of Paris. If you take the train, you go right by it, and just see what's out there. And I said, okay, well, I'll do that. And lo and behold, there's mountains of stuff. It just wasn't digitized. It wasn't online. And so when I started looking at some of that stuff, I thought, there's a book here. There is a story here. There's more about this. And as you were kind enough to mention Path to War, to me, I think you're right. I mean, what I was trying to do is say, this is a really important subject that nobody's written about. So if nobody's written about it, why is that? Is it because there's no source material, or is it because there isn't a story there? And if there's source material, there's probably a story there. So I don't know. Oh, I think I do know why no one's really touched Vichy to this point. But I think that was the moment when I sort of said to myself, I think this is something I want to go deeper into. And then that's where the fun of an historian is. That's when you, at least to me, that's when you have an idea, you have a set of questions, and you start looking at the evidence, and you almost become a detective. You're looking to this story that you're trying to build. And the more I looked, of course, the more clues I found, and the more excited you get about a project.
Well, it's interesting because that is the excitement of the profession, right? Is when you're there and you're doing the digging in the archives, and you start to find things that are kind of different than what the established story that you thought you knew, right?
Yeah.
And in many ways, the story of 1940, and again, you just upon this, and it's something that was continually in my mind, in particular because I work in British history, right? We tend to think of the story of 1940 as the invasion of France, right? The kind of the collapse of the French army, the evacuation of Dunkirk, which I think in this country is seen very much how it's seen in Britain, right? So it's being seen as a remarkable event, one that is a triumphant or a heroic event or something like that, right? And so we are kind of used to seeing that Anglo-American lens, right? And so I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit about that lens, and then as you're kind of doing the archival digging and uncovering that story, how you then started framing kind of a different argument.
Yeah, your point about Dunkirk is great. If you go to Dunkirk in France, if you go to the memorial, it says, the memorial reads, to the heroism of the French soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines and their allies. There's no specific mention of the British at all, and there's no British flag. So the French, that's the British retreating, leaving, and cowardly leaving the fight when the fight was still going on. So you're right, that there's a very different perception of this in the Anglo-American world than there is on the French side. And when you read the documents, that's exactly what comes through. And one of the things working in this project, the Vichy, the people that ran Vichy hated the British much more than they hated. They thought it was the British in the 1920s and 30s that had put France in this position. They thought it was the British who had given up in 1940. They thought it was the British who were trying to take away the entire French Empire. That the people they really hate are in Great Britain. And that runs counter to this image you have of kind of an allies versus axis, right? That we were all kind of together pushing in one direction. And, you know, it reinforces some of the themes that we teach at the Army War College, and several of my colleagues are kind enough to be here tonight, that nations do what they do based on their national interest, not on what the alliance interest is. So in some ways, doing the research was reinforcing some of the things that we were talking about in class, which was great too.
So when we think about that, so when we think about 1940, we think about kind of the Franco-British alliance, right, that's on the Western Front. And then you have the German invasion. And within a few days, I mean, it's apparent that the wheels are coming off, right? And then with a few weeks, it's quite apparent that the wheels are off, right? And I think it's a difficult thing for us to measure how that shock wave then gets from Europe, right? To then gets across the Atlantic, and why it is seen as being so significant in the United States. So I was wondering if you talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, what comes through in the American documents is that the United States just absolutely takes as granted. It's not even something you have to question. It's a fundamental assumption that France is going to do what it did in the First World War. It's going to hold the Germans off for a period of years, not weeks, not months, but years, and that will give the US time to figure out what it wants to do. And when France falls, all of that security architecture, all of those assumptions go away in the blink of an eye. And you can read it in the papers of people like Matthew Ridgway, whose papers we have in Carlisle, where they're literally writing memos saying, what do we do? What do we do? We can't protect the East Coast of the United States. We can't protect the Caribbean. We can't protect the Pacific. We can't protect anything. The number one fundamental thing we thought was going to be true is no longer true. What do we do? And so you can feel that was the comment that Alex read out from Secretary Stimson. It's the same thing that Stimson is sensing. Like, what do we do? And literally nobody has an answer. And that great shock that we're not as safe as we thought we were is what motivates a lot of what I think the United States did in the ensuing 2 or 3 years.
And that's, I mean, that's a pretty frightening proposition, right?
It's terrifying.
It's absolutely terrifying, right? We're kind of national security rests on certain assumptions, right? And then when those assumptions kind of go away, and when there's something that cataclysmically happens, right? It changes kind of the calculus on how people are seeing kind of security at home, but also how they're seeing it abroad, right? So I was wondering, you know, so maybe you could walk us through a little bit of your process of kind of going through the material in French archives, and then going through and starting to do the digging in the United States. And then one of the things that your book does some things that are really exceptional. And one of the things is that Mike is taking really complicated decision making at very high levels and explaining it simply, right? Which is a difficult thing to be able to do. But then also when you mix in the colorful personalities that we have within this book, people like Charles de Gaulle, right? People like Franklin Roosevelt, who's of course involved in it. People like Ian Fleming, who pops up in the book as well, kind of in dark corridors, right? But you have interesting figures that are here within the book that are then creating for us in many ways. It is kind of running color commentary, I would say, are the colorful personalities. So what I'm wondering is, like, as you move from French archives to American archives, how are you making sense of all of these different stories?
Yeah, it's complicated, as you know. I mean, we get training in this and it's still not easy. There were moments, real aha, beautiful moments. I had found in the American archives here at Carlisle, where Jim Scuderi sitting there works, Bill Donovan, who was the director of the OSS, the organization that became the CIA. Donovan made this top secret trip to Europe. So we have his files. And then I just stumbled across the French files of the same trip. So I had what Donovan thought he was doing, and then I had what the French thought he was doing, which was great. And then I had transcribed Gestapo documents, what the French thought the Germans thought Donovan was doing. So I knew as soon as I saw that, I mean, I remember leaving the archive and going into a cafe and just starting to write out ideas like, this is going to be a chapter. This is going to be a chapter. What is Donovan doing coming to Europe? What do the French think this is about? And what do the Americans want it to be about? And it was great. It was a fascinating moment. When you can get two sides of the same thing, it's great. The problem, of course, as you know, is archives rarely work that way.
Yeah.
So the other thing I was trying to do is look for individuals who are kind of through the story. And you mentioned a few of them. There are a few others that probably most Americans don't know. A man by the name of Maxime Weygand, a French general, is one. Another general named Giraud, another French general who's runs through this. And then I got a stroke of complete dumb luck. My friend Andrew Stewart in London, who was working on a separate project, happened to digitize all of these British archives. And this was during lockdown now, so I couldn't go and get these sources. And so I had the British side of it. People like Harold Macmillan, the future British prime minister, was the senior British diplomat in North Africa at this time. And he's writing letters to his friend Richard Makins, and they're gossipy, catty, chatty. They're wonderful. Like, we don't know what these French are doing. We don't have any idea who they are. The Americans are being arrogant. The French are being stupid. They're wonderful. So there were moments I was like, this doesn't fit, but it's getting in the book somehow. Like,
Right.
It's too good not to get in there. And so, you know, I was grateful to Andrew for being able to do that. Doing research in COVID times was a real challenge. And I got very lucky. And our common friend, Vanda Wilcox, who was living in Paris, who went and digitized some material for me as well.
Yeah. So one of the things that was, one of the things that sticks out to me about the book, and it's one, Mike, that you provided an education to me on, is that I always, I kind of had a one-dimensional view of Vichy and of America's relationship with it, right? And I was wondering if you could maybe walk us through a little bit of how you piece together that story and that facet of your argument within the book, because it's central to it, right?
Yeah.
The idea that the United States is not only paying close attention to the fall of France, but then what does the US do when there is a new government that's set up, that is set up as an ideological movement, right? And how does a democracy that's used to dealing with the French Republic, Third Republic, which is also a democracy that sees great kinship between those, how does it then deal with Vichy, which is something very different than what the Americans are used to dealing with, right?
Yeah.
And so I was wondering if you could walk us through that relationship a little bit, because you do a superb job in the book of explaining Vichy and then explaining why Vichy is so important.
Yeah, so part of this also gets back to what we do at the War College, which is, do states do what they do based on their values or their interests? So what Vichy is an example, at least at first, of interest dominating, that the US feels that it needs Vichy to be at least not actively pro-German. The Vichy state kept control of the French fleet and kept control of the French Empire. So it's still a powerful state. France does not disappear, contrary to popular views. It still controls the overseas empire, and it still controls the second largest fleet in the world. That's a powerful state. But then those interests come into conflict with the values. That is, the Vichy state is obviously at least fascist sympathetic, even though it doesn't like to call itself fascist, and probably wasn't. So, you begin to see this tension, and the American people are beginning to think of this as a values thing. The goals of the Atlantic Charter, and if we're fighting for democracy and if we're fighting for freedom, we can't have Vichy as part of that package. Dr. Seuss draws these wonderful political cartoons that are anti-Vichy. Edward R. Murrow, all these famous Americans who kind of step up and say, what are we doing? This is wrong. How do you manage that? So part of it comes from that. And part of it comes from, frankly, just, I think, the stubbornness of American policymakers,
Yeah.
the unwillingness of them to say, we made a mistake, we were thinking about this wrong. Instead, they double down and say, we're gonna continue working with Vichy.
One of the things that I think really does come across in the book is your portrayal of kind of the inner politics within Vichy itself, right? So Pétain and Laval, and the fact that Americans are actually aware in the press of those inner politics, right? So it's not just that, the state's created, people are fuzzy as to what it is. They actually know how the inner workings are working, right?
Yeah. They know who these people are.
Yeah.
My wife and I were just a couple of weeks ago in New York City, and we're walking down the Canyon of Heroes, and sure enough, one of the plaques is to Pierre Laval, who was feted in the 1930s, the French prime minister. He comes back to lead Vichy. So he was Times Man of the Year one year. They all knew who Henri-Philippe Pétain was. Every American in 1940 would have known who Pétain was. Every adult that had any memory at all of the First World War would have known who he was. So these are figures that Americans know. And there are these other characters that come in kind of from the side. This man by the name of René de Chambron, who was a Marquis de Lafayette and was related by marriage to both Pierre Laval and Franklin Roosevelt. These are interesting, powerful, important people. Chambron is so important, in fact, that there's a flag in my academic building that he gave to the United States in the 1970s. And it's right there as you walk down to get a cup of coffee in the cafeteria. So these are people that everybody knew. So like you said, there's no mystery who Pierre Laval is. What Americans are hoping is that there's some blend of carrots and sticks that you can do that can get those people to do what you want them to do and not do what you don't want them to do.
And ultimately not, right? I mean, a big part of this book is about the fact that, you know, both the Americans as well as the British are kind of betting on different sides of different Frenchmen to some degree. And de Gaulle, because in many ways, because of his strong personality, he's a bit of a strong flavor, right? De Gaulle is somebody that Americans are not betting on. They're keeping at kind of arm's length. And I think one thing that's really interesting about your book is that you're bringing in a bit of de Gaulle kind of revisionism in with it, right? And trying to show people about how, because there's all kinds of perceptions that we have whenever you, about historical figures, Charles de Gaulle in particular, right? But one of the things your book does is it's showing how the decision-making is working in the minds of those who are making those decisions at the time, and in particular about de Gaulle. So I thought maybe you could talk a little bit about him.
Yeah, so he is the youngest brigadier general in the French army when France fell. He was working in a political job, deputy under Secretary of Defense or some such. And he made the decision on June 17th, 1940, not to stay in France, but to get in an airplane and go to London, where he gives that famous speech that he gives on June 18th. So and I can talk more about why. The Americans hate him, and I can talk a little bit more about why. So there are kind of two French leaders. And at one point, Churchill turned to Franklin Roosevelt and said, look, we cannot each have our own pet Frenchman. Like we have to figure out what we're going to do about this. And the Americans just despise de Gaulle, won't go anywhere near him, will believe the worst things anybody could say about Charles de Gaulle. And I think there are a lot of reasons for that. But one of them clearly is that what de Gaulle wants is not what the Americans want. What de Gaulle wants is France fully restored to what it was in 1940. Fully back to all of the things that France was, only back under a democratic government as it had in 1940. Just pretend that when it's all over. And he was exactly right.
We're going to open things up in a few minutes to questions from all of you because I don't want to dominate our time here with Mike. I just have a couple more questions though. So what do you hope people, well, you want people to read the books, maybe I shouldn't ask this, but what do you hope the takeaway is from the book? What do you hope readers will emerge thinking differently about this historical moment?
You know, I do think that we treat the first and second a little bit too much black and white and a little bit with too much simplicity. And I would like readers to come across understanding just how complex this was, how difficult this was, how many decisions these folks are making every hour of the day that could have gone a different way, and how much disagreement is not quite the right word, but the American people, although fully behind the war effort, of course, could and did disagree with the way that the United States government prosecuted certain parts of this. So I guess I want people to see the ways in which this time period is incredibly complicated. And I think if you do see that, then the present that we're living in actually makes a lot more sense.
And that is what we do fundamentally.
Fundamentally what we hope we do.
That is what we try to do, right? Which is try to take something that we think we know about and try to complicate it, right? And not everybody likes. Why are you laughing? So how many games are the Pirates going to lose this year?
What do they play? 162 after the new Liberating Agreement? Well, we're both from Pittsburgh, by the way. We're both big at least big Pirates fans. 110 is probably pretty good. I don't know. I was joking with Ian. We were emailing back and forth a little bit. I said Marshall, Roosevelt, Churchill, and de Gaulle together couldn't get this team to not lose 100 games. So I'm not terribly optimistic. But if I might just jump on your earlier point, my friend Alan Luxembourg likes to say that a good historian makes the familiar unfamiliar.
Yeah.
And I think that is exactly our job. And what that sometimes means is challenging what people think they know about something. And in the case of Vichy, it means exposing an element that maybe a lot of Americans haven't thought about at all.
And we're in a moment right now where there's so much really good scholarship that's been written in the last 5, 6, 7 years on the Second World War. Tons of great stuff. It's like a renaissance of Second World War material that's coming out. And Mike, your book is unique. It tells us about a particular moment and why it's important for an American audience. And it does so with, and you're all going to love the book, with such a colorful cast of characters. And you will, at certain moments, throw your hands up in frustration about French generals, about what's going on with diplomats, about about what the public perception of what's going on in 1940 is. So, Mike, your book's wonderful. I hope everybody's Zooming. I hope you all order it. And I'd like to open it up for some questions for people.
Thanks.
Let's give it up for Mike and Ian. Okay, so I'm sure we have plenty of questions from the audience. So if you have a question, just feel free to raise your hand and I will come around. Yes. Go here.
In France today, if you ask an average citizen about Vichy, what would be their response?
Yeah, so Barbara and I, my wife and I have two very, very close French friends that I had dinner with when I was thinking about this project. And one of the two, the male in the couple, went like this when I told him. He went, "That's not a good idea." It is still for them what they would call une histoire vivante, a living history. So for them, they have parents and grandparents and uncles who served in the Vichy government. So it is still a very touchy thing. I would say it's fair to say that the French went from not wanting to talk about Vichy at all to now it's something they can't stop talking about. Now it has become something, it's almost a scab they keep pulling off. And one of the French presidential candidates, they have a presidential election coming up, first round will be next month, has been outspoken in saying that there was nothing wrong with Vichy, Vichy was okay, and that has sparked its own controversy in France. So I would say even in the last 10 years, it has gone from let's not talk about that to let's constantly and incessantly talk about that. And because they're French, they don't agree. They argue intensely about this. And I mean that, tongue in cheek, but people who were victims of Vichy and people who were part of that administration obviously are on very, very different sides of that fault line. But it's been remarkable to me. There's a new documentary series that's just come out. There's a couple new books on Vichy. They don't deal with Vichy's foreign policy at all. They deal with the internal domestic stuff, which is what people in France are really interested in. But that plus Eric Zemmour, this presidential candidate, constantly keeping it in the news has meant that Vichy's everywhere. Mm-hmm.
So you had said earlier that you would talk about why the United States disdained de Gaulle so much.
Why the U.S. hated de Gaulle so much.
Yeah.
There's a legal reason, which is that in American eyes, de Gaulle is nothing more than a brigadier general who doesn't like the government. He has no legal claim to anything. There's a moment when de Gaulle came to the United States and gave Roosevelt a model of a French battleship. And Roosevelt says something to Eleanor Roosevelt, like, well, I'll just give this to one of the grandkids. And Eleanor says, you can't do that. The head of a state gave that to you. And Roosevelt says, he's not the head of a state. He's the head of some elected committee somewhere. Like he's nothing. He means nothing. De Gaulle also, to be fair to the Americans, de Gaulle had a way of doing things intentionally to upset his hosts, intentionally to make the point that I'm in charge here, you're not. So the first diplomat that he sent to the United States was a avowedly anti-American who was such a pain in the butt that the White House finally banned him from even going into the building. I think there were Americans who were afraid that either de Gaulle was just going to take over France and run it as a right-wing dictatorship, or that he was so incompetent that there would be a communist uprising against him that he couldn't stop. I would say it really took until the end of 1944, early 1945, before the Americans finally said, okay, we can work with this guy. It's really late in the game.
Other questions down here? Yes.
Hey, Mike, I didn't hear you talk about the impact of the fall of France on the United States Army, since you're at the Army War College.
Yeah.
I have not read your book, so
Yeah.
How did you address that specifically?
It's a great question, John. There is a flurry of defense spending that happens after the fall of France that is mostly aimed at the Navy, but there is a proposal that gets floated to take the Army from, John, you'll probably correct me on the number, I want to say 228,000 was the interwar strength, to boost it from 228,000 to 4 million. And George Marshall, then Chief of Staff of the Army, said, we don't need that. We can't do it. We can't afford it. Let's pare that down to 2 million. Nevertheless, it's a tenfold increase in the Army. As you know, it brings in the first peacetime conscription in American history, which occurs, a nationalization of the National Guard, all of these things that happen in a flurry. And then, of course, the Air Corps was part of the U.S. Army at that point, too. So all this money that's going into aviation as well. So one of the things that happens because of the fall of France, what I argue in the book is the United States made the decision in May of 1940, June 1940, we are never going to rely on a third state to guarantee our security again. That will never happen again. And it begins here in June 1940. So it's mostly Navy money, but the Army gets tremendous resources thrown at it. George Marshall's voice starts to become a much more important one than it had been before. And as you know, this is when the U.S. Army really begins to rethink training. What do we do about these guys once we send them over to Europe or Asia or wherever they're going to go? What do we want them to know how to do and be able to do? So it's a critical moment. It's a moment unprecedented in American history. And the other thing I was able to do is find the comments of some of the senators who are doing this. And they'll talk about how, 6 weeks ago, we couldn't have gotten a tenth of this budget passed. Now we can't write the checks fast enough. We can't raise the debt ceiling fast enough. We can't get the money in fast enough. And it all happens because of the fall of France.
Question on the steps?
Hello. I guess I have a very fundamental question that I've just never really understood about this. And that's why in the first place did Germany stop and allow France to continue a sympathetic government try to take over wholesale?
It's a fantastic question, and one that I've asked my German academic colleagues where the primary sources are that might help us answer that. And the answer I get from my German friends is, we don't know. So a lot of the documentation in the German archives in World War II was destroyed by the American and British bombers hitting Berlin. So there's a lot of paper that's just missing. There are two theories, neither of which we can prove. The first theory is all the Germans really wanted was a one-front war. So having the Atlantic coast and the English Channel coast and Paris was good enough. That way you knew you kind of had your foot on the throat. The other argument is that the Germans knew that they could not occupy all of France. They didn't have the strength to do it. So if you let somebody else do it, let the French do it, then they take on that burden for you. It's a phenomenal question. If, as Ian was saying, we take in the presumption that France just disappears, that France just collapses, then your question is the perfect question. Like, why not just take the whole thing? If, on the other hand, you assume what I think is right, that France still had the Navy, it still had the empire, it still had, all of the things that France was, then there's a reason to leave it in place. The other thing to keep in mind is what everybody thinks is going to happen is the Germans are going to beat the British. The good money is about, the over-under is about 6 weeks. And then there's going to be another peace conference like the Paris Peace Conference that produced the Treaty of Versailles. For that, the Germans might need a healthy, functional France. So that's what people like Pierre Laval are counting on. In the next 6 weeks, the Germans will knock the British out, and the Germans will realize that they can win a war without us, they can't build a peace without us. But your question is perfect, and it's one of those that we cannot answer with any definitiveness because the documentation just hasn't turned up. But the question's a great one. Yeah.
Yes, over here.
There was also, I should say, in the armistice, the French did say, if the Germans try to take the fleet, we're just going to scuttle it. We're just going to open the doors, let the water come in, sink all the ships. So there was that threat out there that the ships remain French.
I'm just sort of curious, like, what did the fever pitch of like America after the fall of France look like? Because as you mentioned, like France had a very big empire, had a big navy.
Yeah.
Like, I don't know, I'm just like, for at least a couple weeks, like, what did that like highest pitch of like, oh my God, are we gonna have Nazi battleships like off the coast immediately? Like, I don't know, can you give us like a taste of like what did that look like?
Yep, the three big threats, I'll hit the two quick ones real quick, are the French base at Dakar, Senegal, from which the Germans could easily interdict almost any traffic going between North America and Europe. The place I wanted to go for our summer vacation, but it's not going to work, Martinique in the Caribbean, which has France's only aircraft carrier and most of its gold. So you can envision all sorts of nightmare scenarios. The real nightmare scenario in May, June 1940 is that the only reason a state as powerful as France fell is because there are fifth column traitors inside France itself. So it's also in this period that Roosevelt tells the Justice Department, just ignore the Supreme Court on wiretap issues because we need to be able to wiretap. And he literally says, like, we're gonna have to play fast and loose with some civil liberties because national security is at risk. This is the same time, a lot of those people get involved in the Japanese internment. A lot of these people start to worry about what's going on inside the United States. So the simple answer to your question is there is a lot of concern, both from what could happen externally and what might happen internally. The other nightmare scenario, and I came across these documents too. This was another one of those aha moments. Somebody in the United States military figured out that the new German 4-engine bombers can be flown from French West Africa, where the French are building brand new runways for a reason nobody can quite figure out. Those bombers can be flown to Brazil. From Brazil, they can then strike targets in Florida, Puerto Rico, Texas. They can do that. So in other words, you can dream up all kinds of horrifying scenarios if you want to. And there were people doing it in the spring of 1940.
We've got a few questions from Zoom, so I'm going to pop it up to David.
Hi, I'm up here.
Hi, David.
Hi there. All right, we have some online questions here. The first one here is, were the British justified to sink the French Navy stationed at a port in Algeria?
Yeah, so in July of 1940, there's this incident. The French fleet's still intact, right? The French say, if anybody that's not French tries to command these ships, we're just going to sink them. We're just going to scuttle them. Churchill nevertheless gave the order for the British Navy to sink the fleet that was at a place called Mers el Kabir in what is today Algeria. What was then Algeria too, but now it's an independent country. If you ask any Frenchman I've ever met, it's an unjustified attack on a neutral fleet, and it should have been condemned, and the United States should have supported France. If you ask any British person I've ever met, it's perfectly legal, justified, whatever. So that's one of those where you stand tells you where you sit. I can tell you the French, if they didn't, the Vichy French government almost declared war on Great Britain at that moment. If they had, you could have been looking at a very, very different war. Instead, they decided to do a couple of air raids over Gibraltar that they knew probably wasn't going to do very much, just to make the point, and then leave it at that. It is a very important incident for Second World War history because it means that Vichy just, whatever Britain is saying now is a lie. They don't want to hear about it. They don't want to work with them. They don't want to do anything. And the fact that de Gaulle is in London makes him all the worse. They try him in absentia for treason. They sentence him to death in absentia. The relationship between Vichy and Great Britain goes from really bad to almost a state of war. In fact, I think it's Macmillan, maybe it's Hastings, like, I don't understand it. By all the rules of diplomacy, we should be at war with them. You know, we're in between this. I think he calls twilight between peace and war. So in my own view, I can see both sides of it. If I were French, I would react the way Admiral Darlan did, which is to say, in that raid, you killed 1,300 Frenchmen, which means that up to this point in the war, you Brits have killed more Frenchmen than you've killed Germans.
How is it seen in the United States?
So actually, in the United States, most American observers are actually happy about it for this reason. It means a couple of less French capital ships that they have to worry about. Right? The big American fear is the Germans are going to get those ships. So here's a couple fewer ships that you have to worry about. However, your diplomatic problem is now more difficult because the ultimate goal of getting Britain and Vichy kind of talking That's now no longer possible. But Roosevelt, the French ambassador, the Vichy ambassador, comes and just yells at Roosevelt, like, how are you not standing up and defending us? Like, a neutral state was just attacked. And Roosevelt gives him some answer like, well, if I were Churchill, I would have done what he did. You know, nothing I can do for you. Sorry. So again, it's one of those, I can see why Churchill made the order. The admiral that carried it out for the British regretted it his entire life. Always thought it was a stupid order that maybe he should have just found a way to disobey. So a very controversial point.
Okay, you mentioned Darlan. What is your opinion on Darlan?
So Admiral Jean-Francois Darlan is the head of the French military. The OSS code word for him is Popeye because he's so well connected to the French Navy. He's an reactionary, anti-American, anti-British, authoritarian, pro-German. See, am I giving you enough of my indication of how I feel about him? The United States later turned to, I don't want to give away the end of the book, but that the United States later cut a very controversial deal with that drove a lot of Americans crazy. The thought of working with Darlan. I think it's Edward R. Murrow who wrote, "Are we fighting the Nazis or are we sleeping with them?" That kind of an attitude. So yeah, I think I actually say it in the book that no part of this book is intended to revive the reputations of any of the Vichy leadership. It is not my intention to say these people were misunderstood. These people are every bit as awful as they look on the surface, and Darlan is probably the worst of the worst. Maybe Laval.
Okay, we have another one. This one's a little bit longer here. I recently read a very short but riveting account of the deaths of hundreds of French sailors at, and I'm going to butcher this, I do apologize, but Mers
El Kabir, that's the rig we were just talking about, right?
Under British attack in Allen Alport's Britishat Bay. Are the continuing hostilities between Britain and France and the Empire in your book?
I talk about it a little bit. As far as the overseas empire goes, British and French interests are pretty similar. That is, they want to keep the empires going. In fact, it's the one thing that de Gaulle, Vichy, all French leaders agree on, that the empire has got to remain French. Algeria, Morocco, all that stuff has got to remain French. The tensions are there all the way to the end of the war. I would say they're there after the war. I would also say that some of the Brexit stuff we just went through has echoes of it too. British and French interests do not overlap in many ways. They do not see the world in the same way in all situations. And some of that is a legacy of the Second World War. Some of it's actually, I think, a legacy of the First World War. I mean, I guess the British would say it's a legacy of what, Nelson and Drake and everything else, but Napoleon certainly. But all of that produces tremendous tension, and it's another reason why de Gaulle never really trusted the British, even though he's operating out of London. He couldn't wait to get out of London and set up shop in Algeria, which is what he eventually did.
Okay, we have another one here. What changed between World War I and World War II that enabled France to fight a long war in World War I, but that led France to fall so rapidly in World War II?
Yeah, okay, so quick answer to that one is there's two schools of thought among historians. One school says France in the 1930s was such a chaotic, disorganized political place, which it was, that they essentially had lost the Second World War by the middle of the 1930s. They have labor disputes, political disputes, whereas Germany at the same time is in a dictatorship, an awful dictatorship, but that makes them more efficient. In other words, France had lost the war by the mid-30s. The other school of thought says, well, the French are just as good, the French army is just as good as the German army, the equipment is good, the leadership is as good. The French senior leaders, the guys, just made really bad decisions in 1940. So those are the two schools of thought. I tend to lean more towards the first than the second. That is to say, the French Third Republic, which is the government of the 1930s, simply had too much of a revolving door. They just simply war ministers going in and out, too difficult for them to set a strategy. I think also there is something to the argument that the French never really could decide on a grand strategy for dealing with Germany. That is, should they work with Germany, appease Germany, or should they develop a plan for fighting Germany? They went instead with this kind of compromise idea, which gets laughed at sometimes, the Maginot Line, to create this set of defenses. What they were trying to do in the 20s and 30s is say to Germany, we'll put our money into fortifications because fortifications can't hurt you. We're a status quo power. want anything, we're okay with the way things are. The tragedy is that Germany, of course, saw that a very different way. Germany was not a status quo power. So the simple answer to that question, I suppose, is that it's really, really complicated. And I don't think there are too many historians that agree on why France fell as it did in 1940. I think also the other main difference is in 1914, France is attacked early on by the Germans. And instantly French opinion is whatever else we want to do in this war, we have to push Germany out. World War II, of course, there's this period from September 1939 to the spring of 1940 called the Phony War, or the French call it the Drôle de Guerre, the funny war. That is really important, I think, in sapping French morale and making people ask questions like, what is this war really about, right? If it's a war for Poland and Poland's already conquered, then what are we doing? And that kind of spirit is not there in 1914.
Okay, and I have one last question. Can you see any parallels between willingness, and they have that in quotes, to have a government ostensibly allied with the German invaders of 1940 to their evident reluctance to more fully support Ukrainian efforts today?
Wow, we got to 8:50 before the U word came up. Okay, so Mary and Jim and John know what I'm about to say next. Whatever you hear from me is my opinion only, not the opinion of the United States Army, the US government, or any agency therein. Jim, did I give the disclaimer okay? All right. I think, in my experience working with French senior military and senior diplomatic and senior political officials to the extent that I have, their view is that the United States has the luxury, because of an ocean in between the US and Europe, to 1 year focus on China, 1 year focus on the Middle East, 1 year worry about Europe to China, then go back to the Middle East. France doesn't have that luxury. Europe is there, although France has global responsibilities and does an awful lot of global, has a major global effort. It has to live inside Europe. It can't treat Europe the way the United States treats Europe. So I think if my French colleagues were here and you were asking them that question, their answer would be, we have seen the United States too often run very hot on Europe and then decide that the crisis was somewhere else. We can't do that. What that means, I think, is when you're thinking about Russia or Ukraine or even Germany, there has to be a policy that allows us to live together when it's over. That means you have to combine diplomacy with military effort. I want to stress, because of the willingness being put in quotation marks, unless you really know what the French military does, it's impossible to criticize what they're doing. They do an awful lot. And they would also tell you that they are the only European power that is in the EU, in NATO, nuclear powered, has a UN Security Council veto. That gives them an awful lot of power and authority in the world, and they want to use that power judiciously. I don't know if that quite answers the question, but yeah, the only other thing I would say on that, I just saw a thing on Twitter today, so I don't know how accurate it is, that of all the great European powers, France is the least willing to admit, the French people are the least willing to admit Ukraine into the European Union right now. Right? It's like 45% when the rest of Europe's 60% and over. So I just, before we came here, I sent a message to a couple of my French friends and said, why do you think that is? So I'm kind of curious to hear what they have to say. Can we get your time for Jim?
Yep, of course.
Gotta let the guy from Jersey talk. Unless he's not going to. What are you doing, Jim? Oh, Jim. Oh yeah. So Jim reminds me. Jim's my Army. Jim knows how to do this stuff. The other thing I was supposed to say is everything that you hear me say, I have no access to any more information than you guys have. I don't get the top secret super brief about Ukraine before I walk in. So I don't know anything you guys don't know. Thanks, Jim.
We have to wrap up soon, but we have time for one last question.
I just wonder, was there a treaty between the Germans and the Vichy that spelled out what they could do, what they couldn't do?
There is an armistice, and there is something called the Armistice Commission, which is held in Wiesbaden, Germany. So there is an armistice that tells the French, here's where you're allowed to have soldiers, here's where you're allowed to have ships. When Mers el-Kabir happens, when this attack on the French Navy happens, that the French fought back against the British, the Germans lifted a lot of the restrictions on where the Navy could move because they realized that it was doing what you wanted it to do. So the answer is there's no treaty, but there is an armistice, which is a little bit different. And the armistice negotiators on the German side can tell the French, yes, you can do this, and no, you can't do that. There was one more. If we can get maybe one more
was it?
question.
Yeah,
in?
of course.
Well, this is not about Ukraine.
No.
Jim
I was
Crack might just
wondering.
comment.
I was wondering if Lindbergh entered the picture in your book.
Yeah, so Lindbergh is one of the folks who is Charles Lindbergh, the famous aviator, who is very pro-German in his orientation, very isolationist in his orientation, thinks the United States is choosing the wrong side. And what's even after the fall of France, he tones down his pro-German sentiments and his anti-Roosevelt sentiments, and does come out in favor of the rearmament program that Roosevelt is talking about. I think we should be able to defend ourselves. He still was opposed to the United States doing anything to pressure Germany until after Germany declared war on the United States shortly after Pearl Harbor. So the answer is yes, he does change his tone a little bit, but I remain shocked when I read Lindbergh's stuff, just how unbelievably clueless he is about what's happening in the world. And the number of people who nevertheless listened to what he had to say because he was famous. Again, a problem that we see today, right? A famous person says something, they must be right because I've seen their picture before, right? That kind of thing. But yeah, Lindbergh's pretty stomach turning when you read his stuff.
Let's give another round of applause for Michael and Ian. We have books available for purchase up at the cafe if you'd like to get your book signed. Michael's going to stick around and sign some books for you folks. So thanks again for coming out, and everyone have a good night.